you're selling that so many people want to buy?
I don't think I'm selling anything.
Well, I went to a show where you were selling tickets to your show, so people are willing to pay a lot of money to see you speak. What is it that you think that people are hungry for? They want to hear from you.
They're hungry for a discussion of the relationship between responsibility and meaning. And we haven't had that discussion in our culture for 50 years. We've concentrated on rights and privileges and freedom and impulsive pleasure, and those are all useful in their place, but they're shallow, and that's not good, because if people are moored shallowly, then storms wreck them, and storms come along. So I'm talking to people about how they can build a foundation underneath them that works, and people need to know that, because otherwise their lives are harder than they need to be.
But what is it that you have that no one else has? What are you offering that no one else is right now?
Well, I think that is what I'm offering. That's not part of the public discussion, and it's grounded in my clinical knowledge. So I've been a clinician for a very long time, and I'm familiar with the works of most of the great 20th century clinicians, and a reasonable amount of philosophy, and a good swath of literature, and I'm a credible scientist, and so I can bring that all together. And I've tried to bring it all together and to make a case for the significance of individual life and the psychological necessity of courage and nobility and responsibility, these things that sound old-fashioned, but are old-fashioned in the best sense. They're old-fashioned because they've lasted forever and they're absolutely necessary. And people need a call to responsibility because they need to mature. They need to want to be adults. And I don't think we do a very good job in our culture of making a case for why it's a good thing to be an adult.
And two things really made you famous, which is, first of all, is the book, 12 Rules for Life. Mm-hmm. The second one, I think, was an interview that went viral with Cathy Newman of Channel 4 News, which she talked about men and women.
Joe Rogan's podcasts help plenty too.
Right, he's got a big, big following. But that was, I think, really fascinating, that interview, because it was specifically about men and women. And you said at the time, YouTube skews very male and your fan base is very male. Is that still the case? Are you still primarily talking to men?
I would say the talks are probably 60-40, 65-35 male to female. The book sales, I don't know. I doubt it, because usually it's women who buy books, although men do buy nonfiction if they buy books. We don't know the demographics on the books. But the book has definitely expanded my audience, I would say. And that's a good thing as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I never set out specifically to talk to men. My students for most years at university have been primarily female. I think most of my graduate students have been female. It might be about 50-50, but I think it would probably tilt more in the direction of female. So it wasn't something I set out to do. I think, though, that, as I said earlier, well, I can't tell how much of it is merely a consequence of the fact that YouTube skews so male. It might also be something to do with the call to take on voluntary responsibility. I'm not exactly sure why that would be more necessary for men right now. I think it might be because our culture confuses men's desire for achievement and competence with the patriarchal desire for tyrannical power. And that's a big mistake. Those aren't the same thing, even a bit. So, and it's very inappropriate psychologically and sociologically to confuse them. So.
Well, one of the things I want to come back to is this idea. So that you say in the book, there is masculine order and feminine chaos.
Mm-hmm. No, actually, I say that those are symbolic representations of the two things.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. So why is order masculine?
I think it's because our primary social hierarchy structures are fundamentally masculine.
And that's not the patriarchy?
Well, it's not the modern idea of the patriarchy, that's for sure.
I mean, that's my idea of the patriarchy, which is a system of male dominance of society.
Yeah, but that's not my sense of the patriarchy.
So what's yours?
Well, in what sense is our society male-dominated?
The fact that the vast majority of wealth is owned by men, the vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labour.
A very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper-successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
But I could say equally well that most rape victims are women. You know, terrible things happen to people of both sexes.
And you could say that with perfect utility, but that doesn't provide any evidence for the existence of a male-dominated patriarchy. Well, it just means that terrible things happen to both genders, which they certainly do.
But there are almost no women who rape men, for example. So that is an asymmetry there in sexual violence.
Well, yes, there's an asymmetry in all sorts of places, but that doesn't mean that Western culture is a male-dominated patriarchy. The fact that there are asymmetries has nothing to do with your basic argument.
No, but you might equally...
This is a trope that people just accept. Western society is a male-dominated patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. And even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power, it's competence. That's why our society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power. It's not power. If you hire a plumber who's likely to be male, it's not because there's roving bands of tyrannical plumbers forcing you to make that choice. And it's the case with almost every interaction that you have at the face of our culture. You're dealing with people who are offering a service of one form or another, who are usually part of the broad middle class, and who offer, and what you're looking for is the person who can offer the best service, and you can find it. It's not a consequence of being dominated by anything that's tyrannical. And then again, our culture, our Western culture, which is by no means perfect, and certainly has tyrannical elements, like all cultures do, is the least tyrannical society that's ever been produced, and certainly the least tyrannical society that exists now. So where's the patriarchy exactly in all of this?
Well, saying that it's the least tyrannical society is not the same as saying it's not a tyrannical society.
That's exactly why I said it was the least tyrannical
But that's
society.
what I mean. So you haven't debunked the existence of patriarchy then. You've said that actually now is better for women.
I don't have to debunk it. You have to demonstrate its existence.
Okay, well, let's go through it. I'm writing a book about feminism in the moment. Until 1919, there were professions that women were barred from. They simply were not allowed to do it. Until 1880s...
Why would you blame men for that?
Because who was in those professions, who was guarding entry to those professions, who was worried about losing their status if women became doctors?
What do you think it was that emancipated women in the 20th century, just out of curiosity?
Well, a couple of different things. I think it was technology. I think it was the pill helped enormously because it gave
when was that developed?
Well, in the 60s.
Right, so that wasn't 1919.
No, but I also think it was a series of legal changes that started in Britain with the Married Women's Property Act, which said for the first time women are full legal beings under the law. They can own property. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is a structure that has continued throughout, from a time when women didn't have the same legal rights as men to now when they mostly do, but culture still lags behind it. I don't think you and I are necessarily talking at such cross purposes. It's just that your conception of patriarchy, as I see it in the book, is that quite a lot of men are quite nice and they do nice things for women. And
no, that's not my conception of patriarchy. And I don't require men or advise them to be nice, ever.
Well, you do talk about the guy who's the tampon king, the sanitary towel king of India, right?
I wouldn't call that nice.
Okay,
I would call that brave.
Okay.
Did you read about his life when he was trying to develop that?
Yeah.
God, it was absolutely miserable, and he did it anyways. He freed all sorts of women as a consequence.
And I think that was
nice. That's courageous. That's noble. That's visionary. It's not nice.
I think it is also nice. I think it is also something that is, it is honouring your social obligations.
I'm not so sure that that's a social obligation, because many other people would have done it had it been a social obligation. He said what he was concerned about. He saw that his wife was suffering with her monthly period and had to choose between feeding her family and taking care of herself properly, and chose to feed her family and thought he would do something about that. That goes way past nice, especially given what he had to suffer through to do all the experimentation that produced his eventual technology. So this whole patriarchy thing, I think you have no idea how pernicious and dangerous it is.
Well, no, I don't. I really don't. Go on.
Throughout history have fundamentally cooperated to push back against the absolute catastrophe of existence. A terrible death rate, the probability of chronic starvation, early death, disease, the difficulty of raising children with all the death that was associated with that. And to look backwards in time and say, well, basically what happened was men took the upper hand and persecuted women in this tyrannical patriarchy is an absolutely dreadful misreading of history. It's a terrible thing to teach young women, and it's a horrible thing to inflict upon men.
I mean, I absolutely disagree with you. I think that's like saying slavery in the US was actually most people cooperated. Well, no, you didn't. You had a system where one set of people owned another set of people. And until women got full legal rights, they could own property for themselves, they could work. Essentially, they were owned. They were first owned by their fathers and then by their husbands.
Status to the domination by men. You
Yeah.
already said that you thought that what emancipated women primarily in the 20th century was technological revolution.
No, not
Okay,
primarily,
so
but that's one of two. I think that's
it's
two
not
things.
primarily, eh?
No,
you
I
don't think the pill was a primary force in the emancipation of women?
I think
or
it
the
was-
invention of tampons, let's say, or the provision of proper sanitary facilities, toilets, and that sort of thing. You're thinking instead it was the action of courageous feminists in the 1920s that produced a social revolution that overthrew the patriarchy. That's your theory.
Yeah, I think.
That's a foolish theory.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear you say that, but I think, to quote you in the Cathy Newman interview, I think it's a multivariate, right? I think there are lots of different things that all contributed to
Well,
women
then
gaining
let's
full
not
rights.
be assuming that Western society was a tyrannical patriarchy.
Well, no, but that's
then,
one
as
of
our
them,
fundamental
and then
assumption.
other things happened as well. So you have the pill, you have the dishwasher and white goods, labour-saving devices in the home. I think all of those were really important. But you also have things like campaigns for the vote.
Yes, you also have things like that, yes.
So how, when in a system that existed in England until 1918, when half...
Why would you even want to look at history like that? Like, what's your goal?
Because I
Exactly.
think the people who don't look at history are condemned to repeat it. And I think that we are...
What are we going to do? Repeat the persecution of women? You
Yeah.
think that's a realistic possibility?
Yeah, we're sitting
And
here...
How do you see that?
We're sitting
happening?
here in America, right, where we've just had a fifth judge appointed to the Supreme Court who is now anti-abortion, who's now conservative. I think that abortion rights are absolutely fundamental to women being able to function as full humans in society, and I think that is now under threat in America. I think it is extremely smug and complacent to think civilization has peaked, it's all upwards from here.
Yeah, well, good luck with that, I suppose.
It's a living. Like, there are lots of people who agree with me, there are lots of people clearly who agree with you. I wanted to...
No, there are just a lot of people, I would say, who are coming to listen to what I say because they're sick and tired of having their desire to move forward in the world and to achieve something and to take their place as adult males, let's say, who are under the weight of accusations that their ambition and forthrightness is a manifestation of something that's fundamentally tyrannical. They're not happy with that. It's not doing anyone any good, and it's also not true. It's really a terrible thing to do to young men, and it's happening all the time. That's why they're bailing out of universities like mad. There won't be a man left in the social sciences in 10 years in the universities, and it's no bloody wonder. It's an unhospitable place, and it's unhospitable precisely because of this doctrine. Said that throughout history, the fundamental relationship between men and women was one of power, essentially slavery. It's like, fine, believe it if you want. It's not going to do your relationships any good, I can tell you that. So.
Okay, well, we'll see how that one goes. I'm currently married, but I'll raise it with him. I think the universities example is a really fascinating one because you talk in the book about the fact that now women are a majority on 2/3 of college courses in the US. And I've also seen you saying, well, you believe in equality of opportunity, but not equality of outcome. Maybe women...
It isn't only that I don't believe in equality of outcome, I think it's an unbelievably pathological wish and doctrine.
Right,
and it's
but
very
okay.
dangerous. History has demonstrated exactly how dangerous it is. Equality of opportunity is something that anyone with any sense would support, but equality of outcome, it's...
So what's your problem with there not being...
You have to be confused beyond belief to support equality of outcome.
Okay, so what's your problem with there not being enough men in the social sciences? Perhaps women are just cleverer. Perhaps that's why there are more women at university,
Could
right?
be.
Under your doctrine. I don't think that, but that's
Well, I think
the logical
problem
extension
I
of your
have with it
doctrine.
isn't the fact that there's an unequal distribution. The problem I have with it is that the reason that men are bailing out is because of the prevalence of the doctrine that you're espousing. That's the problem I have with it. It doesn't matter that much. They will bail out. I don't see any way that the universities are going to redeem themselves in the next decade. So, and maybe that will be fine, but I doubt it. We'll see.
That seems extremely pessimistic when the numbers of people going to university just generally are going up.
Yeah, well, that's not going to last for very long.
Why not?
Because it's too expensive and the universities are doing all sorts of things that aren't acceptable, mostly ratcheting up the price. So, and decreasing the quality of what they're offering and playing into the hands of the people who are ideological acolytes of the identity politics routines and playing postmodern stunts and pushing neo-Marxism and all these things that are characteristic of the social sciences and the humanities primarily.
See, this is where I find you fascinating to me because, you talk in these quite apocalyptic terms. I think that, someone who will listen to that and think, wow, there's a really big problem. But what we're really talking about is some irritatingly postmodern professors and some students with blue hair and funny ideas about gender in a handful of courses around America and
If that's what we were
Western Europe.
talking about, no one would have paid attention to me for more than about 15 minutes. So you might see this as some surface manifestation that's irrelevant, but that isn't how most people view it. It's certainly the case, too, that this identity politics battle of ideas was a determining factor in the last American election. If Hillary wouldn't have played identity politics, played cozy with the identity politics type, she would have kept the working class and she would be president now. So these aren't trivial issues by any stretch of the imagination. It's not just some kids having a decent time while they're being creatively rebellious at university. It's a much deeper problem than that. The doctrines that I'm opposed to are predicated on, well, one assumption they're predicated on, it's probably the primary assumption, is that the best way to view history is as the domination of a tyrannical male patriarchy, and that's true also particularly of the West, which is a doctrine I find absolutely unpalatable and historically absurd, biologically ridiculous, and ungrateful, among other things.
Who's ungrateful, sorry, in that? Who is being ungrateful?
Look at what you have.
Right.
You live in the best society that's ever been created. You know, I was reading about some Indonesians.
I mean, do you mean me as a woman or me as a
I mean
21st
us.
century person in the world?
I mean us, yeah.
I mean, I'm
You,
incredibly grateful for what I have, but to me the
Then how
project
is
of
it a
politics is...
construction of a tyrannical patriarchy? You're grateful for the productions of a tyrannical patriarchy. How does that make sense?
Because I think life is good. I think it could be better. That's what being
fine.
a progressive
That's a perfectly
means.
reasonable proposition.
But I guess
But that isn't commensurate with your claim that you're the beneficiary of a tyrannical patriarchy.
Why not?
How can it be good if it's the consequence of a tyrannical patriarchy? Tyranny isn't good, is it? I mean, that's the definition of tyranny. Something that isn't good. And yet it's produced all these things that you're grateful for. Like, doesn't that contradiction bother you? Where did what was good come from?
I think I'm benefiting actually from a lot of things that I don't support, that are unearned privileges in my life. I think that's absolutely true.
Like your job?
Like I have a very good job. I had a loving family.
Quit.
Well, I don't think that's going to do the world any good, is it?
That's a hell of a fine rationalization for your privileged position.
Oh, well, fair enough. But if
You could trade it off with someone who's less privileged.
I could.
That'd be a start.
I could do that, but I don't want to, and I won't, and I don't think
Why
I should
not?
be expected to.
Why not? Is it okay for you to occupy a position of privilege in the patriarchal tyranny? And if it is it because you're female? Or is it just because it's convenient?
Let me tell you my political philosophy. I guess I'm a social democrat. So what I believe is that you should, if you have a good life, you should try and pass that on. I believe in a progressive redistributive tax system, for example. It was once said by Lord Mandelson in British politics, New Labour was okay with people being filthy rich as long as they paid their taxes. Now, I'm kind of less okay with people being filthy rich. But
Define filthy rich.
Well, I think I would leave that
You're probably in the top 1/10 of 1% of people who've ever lived on the planet. That would constitute filthy rich by historical standards.
Okay, but I'm not
So
sure that I'm
where is
going
the
to
line exactly?
be able to help the Neanderthals at this point, really, by giving up some money. But this is my point, is that what I believe is, I believe in a structure in which people who have had a good life and had lots of advantages should pay that back, pay that forwards, which I think is the message that you preach as well, right? You have responsibilities. And if you've had, like us, a lot of advantages in life.
Civilization as a tyrannical patriarchy.
But it's not purely a tyrannical
That's
patriarchy,
for sure.
is it?
It's purely not.
Right.
And that's exactly the issue.
But why
Because
would you deal with moral
when you describe it as a
absolutes anyway?
tyrannical patriarchy, then you make a case that it's purely that. And that's exactly what's ungrateful.
Why
It's
is-
not purely that at all.
Why
It
is
has
saying
its
that something
corrupt
has elements of this made
That
the
isn't
same
what's
as it
being
is
said.
purely that?
That isn't what's being said. Merely to define it as a patriarchy implies unidimensionality. And to insist that that's also tyrannical doesn't offer a balanced viewpoint at all.
Well, I think that's probably where your disagreement comes with this, which is because I do not see it in that way. I do not see that as univariate at all. I see it as one
Then why
element.
call it
of
a patriarchy?
Because it describes an overarching structure.
Does it?
Yeah.
What if the patriarchy is fundamentally composed of women? Is it still a patriarchy?
No, that would be a matriarchy.
Would it? So let's say we take a patriarchal structure, like
Yeah.
the medical profession, and we fill it primarily with women. Is it then a matriarchal structure? What makes it a patriarchy to begin with? Is it the hierarchical structure? Is it the fact that it's mostly men? Is it the sociological structure? Or is it the fact that it's mostly men?
Well, I think that's really interesting because male primary school teachers, for example, only 15% of them are men. And I interviewed some of them for my book. And you know what? They report exactly the same things that women do in male-dominated offices, right? They say, people have conversations that I feel excluded from. I feel stigmatized, like I shouldn't be here. People look at me askance when I say I'm a primary school teacher and I'm a man. You know, they kind of reel back. We all make those implicit associations.
So if it is a structure that's dominated by women, then it's also a tyrannical patriarchy.
I think in that case, then men have a way of, they should be able to complain about the fact that a very female-dominated office leaves them feeling out too. Yeah, feeling left out too.
So how do we get something that isn't a tyrannical patriarchy? If it's composed of women, then it's a tyrannical patriarchy, and if it's composed of men, it's a tyrannical patriarchy. We're kind of out of options.
Right, but, well, or you could have an office in which a blend of people of both
so
sexes
work. So
work.
if it's 50-50, then it's not a tyrannical patriarchy.
No, not 50-50. I'm saying that people...
40-60.
I'm saying that there is clearly, when it is only 15% of male primary school teachers, they do feel marginalised and excluded. So
you think the defining hallmark of a tyrannical social structure is the predominance of one gender, and if that was relatively equalised, then all of a sudden it would be a free and open institution.
I don't think that male primary school teachers are being tyrannised. I do think they are being marginalised, and I do think that they feel excluded and stressed by that.
So what do you do about that?
Well, this is what I mean. I think actually, and I'm surprised you don't agree with me on this, that actually having more male primary school teachers would be a really good thing, because boys need role models, actually. People, particularly boys who don't have a father figure in their life, that's really important for them to have a stable adult who shows them what it's like to be a man around the place.
Could be, but you shouldn't achieve it as a consequence of preferential hiring.
No, I don't think it would necessarily need to be preferential hiring. I think it would probably be about making that job, breaking down the stigma to entering that job. I think teaching is a really interesting example. It was seen at the turn of...
I worked in daycares when I was 18, 19.
Right.
You know, there were no men in it.
And how did that make you feel?
I loved it.
Yeah.
You know, the kids, I used to wrestle with the kids, which of course can't do now because everybody knows that would just be a catastrophe. And I used to draw them pictures of monsters and they'd line up for that. And I liked working with kids quite a lot. And I didn't care whether it was female-dominated. I've been in female-dominated my professions my whole life.
Right, I think... I
haven't felt marginalised as a consequence.
Well, then you have been lucky, and I have talked to people who have
might be luck.
The opposite.
Might be careful conduct as well.
Explain that more to me.
Well, why would you assume that it would be luck?
Well, if I say that, you know, there is a statistical analysis and I've talked to a broad range of people, and, you know, you would always expect outliers at either end. Some people have had a really terrible time, some people have had a really brilliant time,
yeah, well,
everybody else in the middle.
One of the things that I've strived to do is not to become resentful.
Well, okay, that's very good. I have to say that your Twitter feed does not give me that impression. You come across as somebody who takes criticism very much to heart. Is that true?
I don't think you have any grounds for that suggestion. I mean, you've seen my interviews online. If I was someone who took criticism at heart, I'd be in a lot more trouble than I am now.
In what way?
Well, I've been criticized endlessly for 2 years. I've been in scandals. I've probably been in, I don't know how many scandals in the last 2 years, and had unbelievably contentious interviews with journalists online, on TV, on radio, in podcasts. If I was someone who couldn't tolerate criticism, the evidence for that would already be clear. Twitter's a strange social network. I've kind of pulled myself away from it. So it's not an easy place to conduct yourself with as much grace as you might. And I think it sort of rewards impulsivity because maybe it's because of the constraint on characters or something like that. So I think that people tend to show their worst on Twitter, and some of that's a consequence of the structure of the technology.
I think I certainly agree with you. I think that's something that we agree on there. I think people are rarely at their best on Twitter.
No, and you know, I pulled myself away from it quite a lot in the last month, mostly to see why. You know, I kind of kept an eye on Twitter, all the social media networks for the last few years, partly to see, well, I'm trying to monitor what's happening around me, I suppose, is probably the right way of thinking about it, and to see if I'm making mistakes and how they might be rectified. But I don't think Twitter's been good for me, and I don't think the reply function on Twitter is useful, and I think the fact that so many people on Twitter are anonymous is not a good thing at all.
Do you think you'd be less angry if you went on Twitter? That's something I think quite a lot. I would be come into contact with less things that annoyed me on a daily basis.
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. Yeah. I think that's definitely the case. And I've talked to other people who've pulled back from Twitter and experienced the same thing. I don't know what it is exactly, but there's something about Twitter that seems to really heighten the desire of people to be provocative. And maybe it's the case that only people who are feeling irritable respond. We don't know, like if you put up a post and 1,000 people read it, certainly 1,000 people don't respond. A few people respond. Well, maybe it skews way over to those people who had a bad day. Like, we have no idea, right? Because it's a communication channel that no one understands. We're not evolved to understand it. We're not evolved to use it. We can't interpret it. Plus, you're interacting with random strangers, which is something you never, ever do. And it's never the same set of random strangers. And you don't react to Twitter like it's random strangers. You react to Twitter like it's a person that you know. And it isn't.
You write in 12 Rules for Life about having had violent impulses that you didn't act on. And I think in Maps of Meaning, you sort of elaborate on that. You say you fantasize about stabbing a classmate in the neck. And you say you're very clear about the fact that you've never, ever thought that you would take those seriously. But it just does make me think whether or not, are you somebody who thrives on anger, who finds anger to be something that they need in their life, that they find motivates them to do the things that they need to do?
Those are two different questions.
Okay, you can answer them both.
One is whether I thrive on it, and the answer to that is most certainly not. So I actually don't like conflict.
Then how have you ended up doing this as a job, which is arguing with people, right?
Just because no, that's not my job. It's not to argue with people.
Okay.
So my job is to not do things that I don't think I should do. Right, and my government made the mistake of assuming that compelled speech was acceptable as long as it was motivated by hypothetical compassion. And that's not happened for me. So I made that point. It wasn't because I wanted to or because I enjoyed it. I don't really like conflict. I'm actually a rather agreeable person, which is partly why I'm a clinician. And so I find the constant conflict exhausting. But that's not the issue. You're not morally obligated. You're morally obligated to do things other than that which you like. So now I really do enjoy the lecture series that I'm doing. And the reason for that is that it's not political in its essence. I'm trying to do everything I can to bring people who are trying to develop a vision for their life together and to encourage them to act more responsibly, but not in a finger-wagging sort of way, but because I've come to understand that the meaning that sustains you in life is mostly to be found through responsibility. And through the voluntary adoption of responsibility, you're very likely to find your fundamental strength. And I think that that's clinically unassailable observation. And that's all very good, and I'm very pleased to be doing it. And it seems to be having a salutary effect as far as I can tell. And but it's not because I thrive on anger. I mean, you were at my show, two
on Thursday night, yeah.
How much anger was there in that?
Well, I thought it was fascinating because it was in Long Island. We drove to it and we went past a Lamborghini dealership, a Porsche dealership. This is not a poor area. The audience was, I would say, very, as I was surprised how many women there. It was pretty mixed. It was overwhelmingly white. And I thought you talked, you said at the end, this is more incoherent than I normally am. You ranged across quite a range of subjects from, status in monkeys to perception. But the things that the crowd clapped and they applauded where you went, oh, you can't say that, that's a microaggression. Or multiculturalism is a scourge that is sweeping Canada. And what I got was a strong sense...
No, that has swept Canada.
Okay. Well, what I got was a very strong sense of people whose lives...
I never said that it was a scourge that swept Canada either. I wouldn't have said that.
Okay, well, I will go back and check your exact wording of what you said, but you definitely...
I'm not in favor of it as a fundamental doctrine.
Right, okay.
But I don't think it's a scourge.
So I wonder if you and I mean the same thing when we talk about multiculturalism, because you have a First Nations room in your house, right? You have a lot of First Nations stuff. How is the coexistence
I'm the honorary member of a First Nations family, as a matter of fact.
Which is wonderful. I have a First Nations artist when I went to Canada last year. But that, to me, is the essence of Canadian multiculturalism, that culture being preserved and living alongside the Anglophone culture that, in some senses, supplanted it. How is that not multiculturalism?
Well, multiculturalism is the idea that the cultures can all be put together in a single place with no overarching structure or undergirding structures. That's not the case. How can that possibly be the case? That defines the situation in the world.